She was Boston's most celebrated daughter until one man's lie destroyed everything she had ever been. The night her father banished her, Margaret Calloway didn't scream. She didn't beg. She simply picked up her mother's locket and walked out the door with her head held high even as her heart was breaking apart at the seams. Sentenced to work as a ranch hand in the dust and heat of New Mexico, she was supposed to be humbled, supposed to be broken. Instead, she found something no Boston ballroom ever gave her the truth about who she really was. If you love a story about a woman who refused to stay shattered, subscribe. Now hit like and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far Margaret's story travels. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck midnight, and Margaret Calloway had not moved from the chair in her father's study for 3 hours. The fire in the hearth had burned down to orange embers. The crystal decanters on the sideboard caught what little light remained, throwing amber shapes across the Persian rug, across the shelves of leather-bound books, across the gilt-framed portrait of her grandfather, the man who had built this house, this name, this reputation that her father now claimed she had destroyed. She had not cried. She was too far past crying for that. Her trunk sat at the front door already packed by the household staff who had moved around her like ghosts, averting their eyes, folding her silk dresses with trembling hands. Margaret, who had her sitting room, her books, her careful social calendar, her entire carefully constructed existence in this house, had been erased from it in a matter of hours. Margaret Calloway, once the most admired debutante in all of Boston, was being written out of her own life like a character the author had decided to discard. Her father's voice came from the doorway. Margaret, he had returned from his club. She could smell the cigars and brandy before she saw him. The carriage will be at 4. She turned and looked at him, really looked at him, searching for any trace of the man who had lifted her onto his shoulders at Sunday picnics, who had read to her by lamplight when she was small, who had once told her she had a mind sharp enough to run a country, if only the country were sensible enough to let her. She found nothing of that man in the face watching her now. Papa, her voice was steadier than she expected. I swear to you on Mama's life, I never touched Harrison Blackwell. I never. Enough. His hand cut the air between them. Harrison's father showed me the letters. In your own hand. Those letters were forged. Margaret rose from the chair, her voice gaining the edge that Boston drawing rooms had always found unseemly in a woman. Harrison Blackwell pursued me for 6 months. When I refused him, enough. He said it again, quieter this time, which was worse. He walked to his desk and pulled an envelope from the top drawer. This is a letter of introduction to Warren Sutton. He owns a cattle operation in New Mexico territory. You'll work for him, cook clean, help with the animals, whatever he requires. You'll earn your way. Margaret's stomach turned to ice. You're sending me to work as a servant. I'm sending you to learn the value of what you've thrown away. His jaw was tight. The Margaret Calloway I raised would never have been found in a man's hotel suite at midnight. I went there to return a necklace. Her voice cracked, the first fracture, the first sign that the composure was costing her something. Harrison's sister left it at our garden party. He said she was desperate to have it back. He said. Her father turned away, facing the window that looked out over the lamplit street below. You were seen, Margaret. 2 witnesses, a hotel clerk. Harrison's account was corroborated on every point. She knew then that it was over. Harrison Blackwell had been thorough. He had built his lie like a craftsman builds a cabinet, every joint fitted, every surface smooth. She had nowhere to press that would make the thing come apart. When you discover I was telling the truth, she said quietly, pulling it on her gloves, don't come looking for me. He didn't turn from the window. If that day comes, he said, I'll have already lost what matters most. She left the room before he could see the tears that finally began. Her mother found her in the bedroom just after 3. Vivian Calloway appeared in the doorway, with her hair loose, her eyes swollen, looking nothing like the composed woman who had presided over 1,000 dinner tables and 1,000 social obligations with equal grace. She looked like a woman who had been weeping for hours and had not yet decided to stop. Mama, Margaret turned from the window. You don't have to. Hush. Vivian crossed the room and pressed a small velvet pouch into Margaret's hands. Inside was a gold locket, delicate old worn from being held. My grandmother's. Don't let your father know I gave it to you. Margaret opened the locket and found a tiny portrait inside. Her mother, 20 years younger before Boston society, had taught her to choose survival over instinct. Mama, I can't take this. You can and you will. Vivian's hands framed her daughter's face, thumbs brushing across cheekbones that were still wet. I believe you. I know my daughter's heart. Then why? The word came out broken. Why won't you stop him? Vivian's expression didn't waver, but something behind her eyes shifted, something that looked less like certainty and more like pain. Your father is terrified. The Blackwells are powerful. He's already lost 2 major contracts. If he publicly defends you and they move against him, there's nothing left. Not just for him, for your brother's future. For everyone except me. Margaret stepped back, tucking the locket into her coat pocket. I understand perfectly. No, you don't. Vivian's voice turned sharp, the sharpest Margaret had ever heard it. You think this is about money and reputation. It's about fear. It's a terrible kind of fear, the kind that makes men do the worst thing they'll regret for the rest of their lives. But it's still fear, not indifference. Her mother caught her arm. Write to me, please, even if you hate us both. Margaret wanted to refuse. She wanted to walk out the door with her spine straight and her silence intact to make her absence hurt the way their choices had hurt her. But her mother's eyes held something her father's hadn't doubt. Beautiful, painful, important doubt. I'll write, Margaret whispered, and then she was gone. The train journey took 4 days each mile, pulling Margaret further from the cobblestones and gas lamps of Boston, from the shuttered windows and drawn parlor curtains of the life she had known. She shared a compartment with 2 other women traveling west. One was a widow named Frances, sharp-eyed, kind-voiced, heading to teach school somewhere in Colorado. The other was a young woman named Alice, barely 20, traveling to meet the man she'd agreed to marry through a newspaper correspondence. What's waiting for you in New Mexico? Frances asked on the second afternoon, her needlework in her lap, her eyes over her glasses. Margaret looked out at the flat, endless plains unspooling past the window. Penance, she said. Alice laughed, assuming it was a joke. Aren't we all running from something? I'm running from a mother who thought love was something you negotiated like a trade agreement. I'm not running, Frances corrected, mild and firm. I'm walking towards something. There's a difference. Margaret turned that over in her mind for the rest of the afternoon. Was there a difference she had not chosen to leave? She had been sent. She was not walking toward New Mexico. She was being carried there by a current she hadn't stepped into willingly. But the letter her father had given her sat in her bag like a coal. And that night when the train rocked through the darkness and neither Frances nor Alice could sleep, Margaret pulled it out and read it again. This young woman requires firm guidance and honest labor to correct certain moral deficiencies. She is educated but impractical and accustomed to a life of privilege. I trust you will put to proper use. Moral deficiencies. She crumpled the letter in her fist, then smoothed it out again. Crumpling it didn't help. The words were still there. Frances appeared in the corridor wrapped in a shawl and sat down beside her without asking permission. Can't sleep either, Margaret said. Never could on trains. Frances glanced at the letter, then away. You don't have to tell me. Margaret folded the letter and put it back in her bag. My father sent me away. He believes a lie told by a man I refused. Frances was quiet for a moment. My husband's family, she said slowly, owned most of the town where we lived. When he died, they expected me to marry his brother Harold, a man who had once cornered me in a barn and made it very clear what kind of woman he thought I was. She smiled, but there was iron underneath it. I said no. Suddenly I was ungrateful, disrespectful, a woman who didn't know her place. What did you do? I sold everything I owned, bought a train ticket, and decided I would rather teach children their letters in the middle of nowhere than spend 1 more year in a place that thought it owned me. Frances squeezed Margaret's hand. Whatever they're calling you, wherever they've sent you, you get to decide who you are when you get there. They don't get to write that story. Only you do. The town of Crestwood, New Mexico was nothing like Boston. Where Boston had cobblestones and gas lamps and buildings that spoke of permanence, Crestwood had dirt streets and wooden storefronts, and a sky so enormous it made Margaret feel like the top of her head might come off. The train station was barely more than a platform in a small office where a sun-reddened man marked arrivals in a ledger with the blunt end of a pencil. Margaret stepped off the train into heat she had not expected in spring. Miss Calloway. She turned. A man was approaching across the platform, tall, weathered, wearing work clothes that had seen better days and a hat that had seen even worse. He moved with the unhurried certainty of someone who had learned long ago that rushing rarely changed outcomes. "Yes," she said, straightening her spine out of habit. "I'm Margaret Calloway." "Gideon Cross." He picked up her trunk with one hand barely breaking stride. "Foreman at Sutton Ranch. Warren sent me to collect you." He glanced at her once, just once, and Margaret had the unsettling sense of being assessed with considerable accuracy. "Wagons this way." She followed him across the platform, her heeled boots clicking awkwardly on the boards. "How far is the ranch?" "3 hours by wagon. We'll stop once to water the horses." He helped her up onto the wagon with a hand that was entirely calloused and entirely impersonal. His palm was rough against her gloved fingers, the kind of roughness that came from years of actual work rather than from any pretense of it, and Margaret felt her cheeks warm for reasons she couldn't entirely explain. The wagon lurched forward, and she gripped the edge of the seat. On both sides of the road, the desert stretched away in every direction, scrub brush and sage red earth, and distant mesas that shimmered in the heat like something half-dreamed. A hawk turned slow circles in the white sky overhead. Nothing else moved. "Is it always this hot?" Margaret asked after 20 minutes of silence, had made it clear that Gideon Cross was not a man who felt the need to fill silence. "This is spring," he said. "Wait till August." She pressed her handkerchief to the back of her neck. "What does Mr. Sutton expect me to do exactly?" "Whatever needs doing, kitchen work, cleaning, helping with the animals." He glanced at her sidelong. "Your father's letter said you needed correction." His tone was neutral, no mockery, no judgment, just the fact of the thing. "It also said you'd done something to shame the family without being specific about what." Margaret kept her eyes on the road ahead. Men who tell the whole truth rarely leave out the details. "My thinking exactly." Gideon guided the horses around a rut in the road. "So I'll ask you straight. Did you do it, whatever they're accusing you of?" She turned and looked at him fully, at the sun-hardened profile and the steady hands on the reins. "No," she said. "I was falsely accused by a man I rejected. He had the money and connections to make people believe his version." Gideon considered this for a moment. "Good enough," he said, and returned his attention to the road. Margaret stared at him. "That's it. You just believe me." "I know liars." His voice was unhurried. "You're not one." She turned back to face forward at the desert stretching out before her, the locket warm against her chest, where she tucked it inside her dress. It was the first time in weeks that anyone had said that to her without qualification, without doubt, edging the corners of the words. "You're not one," yelled, simple as a nail driven straight. She didn't know what to do with it. The Sutton Ranch appeared on the horizon just as the sun began its descent, turning the desert the color of old copper. It wasn't grand, a main house of adobe and timber, a barn, several outbuildings, a bunkhouse set back from the rest. But it was solid. It looked like something that had been built to last. Warren Sutton met them in the yard. He was in his 60s, silver-haired, with the kind of eyes that had spent decades calculating distances between water holes, between cattle, between what a man had and what he needed. "Miss Calloway." He didn't offer his hand. "Your father's letter was specific about your circumstances." "I imagine it was," Margaret said. "I run a working ranch. Everyone here earns their place. You'll start in the kitchen with Dolores. She'll teach you what you need to know." He turned to Gideon. "Check the east pasture fence. Martinez says there are breaks near the canyon ridge." Gideon tilted his hat and led Margaret toward a small adobe building behind the main house, from which wood smoke and the smell of roasting meat drifted through an open door. "Dolores," he called into the kitchen. "Got your new helper." A woman appeared in the doorway. She was compact and fierce-eyed, with gray-streaked black hair, and the bearing of someone who had long ago decided that anyone who wasted her time was not worth her consideration. Her gaze moved over Margaret from boots to hat with the efficiency of a customs inspector. "Dios mío," she muttered. "Another one." "Another one?" Margaret asked. "Sutton's taken in 3 before you," Dolores said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Rich girls sent west to learn humility. 2 lasted a week. One made it 3 months before she paid a drover $10 to take her to the stage." She stepped closer, examining Margaret like a horse she wasn't sure about yet. "How long you think you'll last?" Margaret thought about her father's study, About Harrison Blackwell's face as he told his lies. About her mother's doubt, that beautiful, painful doubt. As long as it takes, she said quietly. Dolores held her gaze for a long moment. We'll see, she said at last. Go inside. I'll find you something to cook in that won't catch fire. The first morning began at 4:30. Dolores's hand shook Margaret's shoulder before the window showed even a hint of dawn. Up! Breakfast doesn't cook itself. Margaret dressed in the darkness, fumbling with the rough cotton dress and apron Dolores had set out, her fingers so accustomed to buttons and silk clumsy with the unfamiliar ties. By the time she stumbled into the kitchen, Dolores already had 3 cast-iron pots going on the wood stove and was kneading bread dough with both hands in what appeared to be personal animosity. Can you crack eggs without getting shells in the bowl? Dolores asked without looking up. I can try my way. Don't try, do. She pointed to a basket on the counter. 2 dozen, in that bowl. Margaret picked up the first egg, tapped it against the bowl's edge, the way she had watched their cook do it 1,000 times, and watched half the shell crumble directly into the yolk. Dolores's sigh was its own entire sentence. Like this. She took an egg, cracked it against the rim with one decisive motion, and the contents fell clean and whole. One hand, confidence, go. 20 minutes later, Margaret had managed 18 acceptable eggs. Her hands were sticky, her back ached from bending over the counter, and Dolores had already finished the biscuits, fried the bacon, started the gravy, and begun slicing bread. Set the table, plates there, forks there. The men eat fast and they eat a lot. Keep the coffee coming or they'll complain. The ranch hands arrived exactly at 5, a stream of weathered men who took their seats without ceremony. Gideon came in last, his dark hair damp at the temples. He sat at the end of the table and reached for the coffee pot, and Margaret grabbed it first. The cup sloshed. Coffee spread across the tablecloth in a dark stain. Careful, the man beside him said, jerking back. I'm sorry, let me get a cloth. Bring the cloth. Gideon's voice was calm, cutting through her apology. He caught her eye for a brief moment, his expression holding nothing worse than steadiness. Then bring the coffee. She fetched the cloth, mopped the spill, refilled the cup, and made it through the rest of breakfast without further incident. When the men filed out, leaving behind empty plates in the silence of people who had already moved on to the next task, Margaret stood in the wreckage of the meal and tried to count that as a victory. You wash, Dolores said. I'll dry, then we start on lunch. We just finished breakfast. Dolores looked at her as if she had said something genuinely concerning. You think food appears on its own, lunch must be ready by noon. That gives us 6 hours. We also have laundry. Margaret plunged her hands into the scalding dishwater and bit the inside of her cheek to keep from making a sound. Lunch came and went in a blur of burned fingertips and spilled flour. The afternoon brought the laundry massive tubs of scalding water, a washboard that scraped her knuckles, raw shirts heavy enough to drag her arms down when wet. 2 hours and her hands were bleeding, her dress was soaked through, and she had managed perhaps a third of what Dolores had already finished. I can't do this, she said aloud. The words escaped before she could stop them. Dolores looked up from the clothesline where she was hanging work shirts with the efficiency of someone doing something she'd done 10,000 times. Then quit, she said simply. Go tell Sutton you're done. He'll give you money for a stage ticket. You can be back in Boston by the end of the month. Margaret looked at the shirt in her bleeding hands, at the mountain of laundry still piled in the tub. She thought about Harrison Blackwell's face, about the 2 witnesses who had looked her father in the eye and lied, about the woman she had been in Boston, the woman who had smiled at the right people and said the right things and still ended up standing in her father's study at midnight while everything she'd built was burned to the ground around her. That woman had done everything right, and it hadn't protected her. I'll learn, Margaret said quietly. Dolores said nothing, but something in her posture, some slight, barely visible softening, told Margaret she had just passed a test she hadn't known she was taking. Dinner was quieter than breakfast. The men were tired in a particular way, the heavy, satisfied tiredness of people who had spent themselves on actual work. Margaret moved between kitchen and table until her feet were numb and her arms felt like wet rope. Gideon lingered after the others left, turning his coffee cup in his hands. You did all right today, he said. She almost laughed. I ruined breakfast. I destroyed half the laundry. I burned my hand twice on the stove. You're still here. He stood, carried his cup to the sink, glanced at her over his shoulder. That's more than the last three managed. He moved toward the door, then paused. Dolores works you hard because she's testing you. She wants to know if you'll break. Why does she care? Because she broke once, long time ago. He settled his hat. Get some sleep. Tomorrow's harder. Margaret helped Dolores clean the kitchen in silence, too exhausted even for thought. When she finally collapsed onto her narrow bed in the small room behind the kitchen, her body was a map of everything the day had taken from her: blisters on her palms, burns on her forearms, muscles that felt like they'd been wrung out and left to dry. But she had survived it. She lay in the darkness, listening to the coyotes somewhere out in the desert, to the wind against the window glass, to the faint and mournful notes of someone's guitar drifting from the bunkhouse. She pulled out her mother's locket and pressed it against her palm. She thought about Francis on the train. You get to decide who you are when you get there. They don't get to write that story. She tucked the locket under her pillow and closed her eyes. She did not know, lying there in the dark with her blistered hands and her bruised dignity, that Gideon Cross was the man who would show her exactly who she was. But that discovery was still weeks away, hidden behind calloused hands and honest silences, and the slow, terrifying recognition that sometimes the place you're sent as punishment is the place where you finally learn what you're made of. The days that followed had a rhythm Margaret had not expected to find bearable. 4:30 in the morning, the kitchen before dawn, breakfast for 12 men who ate like they were fueling machinery, not feeding themselves. Then dishes, then lunch preparation, then laundry or cleaning or whatever Dolores decreed necessary. Then dinner. Then sleep so deep it felt less like rest and more like falling. By the end of the first week, Margaret had stopped flinching when the scalding dishwater hit her hands. By the end of the second, she could crack 24 eggs in under 10 minutes without a single shell in the bowl. Small victories. She collected them the way she had once collected calling cards from Boston's finest drawing rooms, carefully, deliberately aware that each one represented something larger than itself. Dolores watched all of it and said very little. It was on the 8th day that Samuel Sutton appeared in the kitchen doorway during the lunch preparations and told her Cole needed help moving cattle to the east pasture. Margaret looked down at her flour-dusted apron. I don't know anything about cattle. Then you'll learn, Warren said. Go change, you've got 10 minutes. 15 minutes later, Margaret stood in the stable wearing borrowed trousers that hung too wide at the hip and a work shirt that smelled faintly of horse. Gideon was saddling 2 horses with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had done this particular thing more times than he could count. He looked up when she came in, took in her outfit once without comment, and went back to tightening the cinch. You ever ridden? He asked. Central Park, side saddle, at a gentle trot. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but the shadow of one. This won't be like Central Park. He led an older bay mare out of her stall. This is Bess. She's 15 years old, she moves slow, and she doesn't tolerate nonsense. She's perfect for you. He helped Margaret into the saddle, his hands brief and impersonal at her waist, efficient at the stirrups, and she felt her cheeks warm in a way she refused to examine. Reins in your left hand, heels down. When you want to turn, use your legs more than your hands. Bess knows her job. You just have to stay in the saddle. They rode out toward the east pasture where a herd of perhaps 60 cattle moved across the red earth in that restless, purposeless way of animals that seemed to operate without consensus. 2 other ranch hands were already there, a compact, quiet man named Martinez and a younger one, barely 20, named Ben, who had smiled at Margaret once over breakfast like she was something interesting rather than something foreign. We're pushing them to fresh grass, Gideon said, riding up beside her. Stay on the outside of the herd. Keep them grouped. If one breaks, let me or Martinez handle it. It sounded simple. It was not simple. The cattle moved like a single organism with 40 different opinions. The moment Margaret thought she understood the pattern, a cow on the far end would wheel away from the others, and the whole fluid shape of the herd would shift to compensate. Bess, to her credit, seemed to understand exactly what was needed, cutting and pivoting beneath Margaret with an authority that had nothing to do with anything Margaret was doing with the reins. A cow broke from the left flank, heading directly toward Margaret in the fence line beyond her. Bess sidestepped, fast, instinctive, immediate, and Margaret lost her balance, her weight sliding sideways, the ground rushing up to meet her. Hands caught her waist. hard, certain hands that stopped her fall mid-motion and set her firmly back into the saddle. Gideon had ridden up beside her. His right hand was still at her waist, his left holding his own reins with casual authority. He held her until he was sure she had her balance, then let go without comment. "Sit back," he said. "Let Bess work. Trust the horse." Margaret sat back. Bess moved again beneath her, confident and unhurried. The errant cow was turned back toward the herd by Martinez, who managed it without breaking his own rhythm. By the time they reached the new pasture and the cattle settled into the fresh grass with the immediate satisfaction of animals, who had forgotten already what they'd been anxious about, Margaret's hands had stopped shaking. Her inner thighs were screaming from gripping the saddle, and her lower back felt like it had been rearranged by someone with no formal training, but she had stayed in the saddle. Mostly. Gideon rode up beside her as the other hands headed back toward the ranch buildings. "Not bad," he said. "I nearly fell off." "Nearly, you didn't." He studied her profile. "There's a lot of daylight between those two things. Is that your version of a compliment?" "It's my version of the truth." He turned his horse toward home. "Come on, Dolores will have words for both of us if we're late." That night, lying in her narrow bed with muscles she hadn't known existed, now making themselves loudly known, Margaret stared at the ceiling and tried to reconstruct the moment Gideon's hands had caught her. The certainty of it. The absence of hesitation. In Boston, men had touched her gloved hand in greeting, guided her by the elbow through doorways, partnered her in dances with careful propriety. All of it deliberate, performed, observed. This had been none of those things. It had simply been a man keeping someone from hitting the ground with no ceremony attached to it and no expectation of recognition. She found to her considerable surprise that she was still thinking about it when she fell asleep. 3 weeks into her time at the Sutton Ranch, Dolores cornered her. They were in the kitchen after supper, Margaret washing and Dolores drying, the comfortable rhythm of it, filling the silence that had gradually become less strained and more companionable. Through the small window above the sink, the corral was lit by the last of the evening light, and Gideon was working a young horse in the space beyond, turning the animal in patient circles, asking it questions, with the reins waiting for answers without impatience. "He watches you," Dolores said without preamble. Margaret did not look up from the pan she was scrubbing. "I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do." Dolores set a dry plate on the stack with a decisive click. "The other women Sutton brought here, he was polite, helpful when they needed it. Nothing more. With you he stays, he checks, he finds reasons to be in whatever part of the ranch you're working." She paused. "He doesn't do that. He's a man who lost his wife 4 years ago," Dolores said flatly. "Childbirth. Lost the baby too." She set another plate. "He shut himself up inside himself after that, like a man boarding a house before a storm. He's been boarding ever since." Margaret was quiet for a moment. Outside, Gideon moved the young horse through another circle, unhurried, attentive. "I'm not here for that," she said at last. "I'm here to work, to prove I'm not what they said I was." "And what did they say you were?" Margaret pressed her lips together. "A woman without morals. A liar. Someone who destroyed an innocent man's reputation out of spite." Dolores was quiet for a long moment. Then, "And what do you say you're?" Margaret looked up from the wash basin, the soapy water going cold round her wrists. "I don't know anymore," she admitted. The words cost her something. "I used to know exactly who Margaret Calloway was. Now I'm just someone who can almost keep up with the laundry." Dolores made a sound that might in another person have been a laugh. "That's more than most people manage." She touched Margaret's shoulder briefly, her hand rough and warm. "Give it time. Out here you become who you need to be, not who someone else decided for you." The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Warren brought it to the kitchen himself, his expression carefully neutral. The envelope extended toward Margaret like he wasn't entirely sure what he was handing her. "From back east," he said and left. Margaret recognized her mother's handwriting immediately. Her hand shook slightly as she broke the seal, aware of Dolores at the stove, aware of the forced ordinariness of both of them, pretending this was not a significant moment. "My dearest Margaret, your father has discovered the truth about Harrison Blackwell, the man's sister. Do you remember Diana came forward last week? She confessed that Harrison had paid her and the hotel clerk to provide false testimony against you. She said her conscience had destroyed her sleep for months. Your father went to the Blackwell estate 2 days ago. I don't know what was said, but he returned home and locked himself in his study for the better part of a day. He has written you a letter which I've enclosed. I have not read it. Whatever he says, know that I have never for one moment stopped believing in you. We cannot undo what has been done. But if you choose to return, your father will ensure your reputation is fully and publicly restored. The Blackwells will issue a formal retraction. Write to me even if only to say you've received this. I need to know you are whole. Your loving mother Margaret set it down with hands that were not entirely steady and opened the second envelope. Her father's handwriting was different from how she remembered it, less certain, the lines slightly uneven, like the pen had been lifted and set down more than once. Margaret, I have failed you in the way that matters most. I chose my own fear over my own child. I sent you away when I should have fought for you, and I will carry that for the rest of my life. Thomas Ashworth Harrison. Blackwell will face consequences for what he's done. His family has agreed to a full public retraction. Your name will be restored completely. You may come home whenever you wish. I understand if you cannot forgive me. I am not certain I deserve to be forgiven. Your father, Margaret, stood very still for a long moment. Then Dolores, who had been studying the stove with unusual intensity, said, "What does it say?" "They know the truth." Margaret's voice came out flat, a little hollow. Harrison Blackwell's sister confessed, "My father wants me to come home." Dolores turned from the stove and looked at her steadily. And I don't know." Margaret pressed the letters against her sternum. "I need to think." She went to her small room and lay on the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling with her mother's locket in her palm. Everything she had wanted, vindication, apology, the restoration of her name, was right there in 2 envelopes on the kitchen table. She could go back to Boston. She could be Margaret Calloway of Beacon Hill again, with silk dresses and calling cards in the social calendar she had managed with such careful precision. But she looked at her hands. She had not had hands like this in Boston. These hands had knuckle calluses and old burn marks and the particular toughness of skin that had been scalded and dried and worked for weeks without respite. These were not the hands of a debutante. They were the hands of a woman who had learned something real. A knock came at the door. "Margaret," Gideon's voice. "It's me. Can I come in?" She sat up, pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes. "Yes." He entered with his hat in his hands, looking slightly too large for the small room, standing a careful distance from the foot of the bed. He sat on the edge of the single chair in the corner. "Samuel told me about the letters. I wanted to check on you." "I'm fine." "You're a terrible liar." He said it without heat. "I thought you told me you'd been falsely accused." "I had been." She looked at him. "They found out." Harrison's sister confessed. "My name's cleared. My father wants me back." She paused. "It's everything I wanted." "So why do you look like someone died?" She laughed, and the sound was slightly broken at the edges. "Because I think someone did. The woman who got on that train in Boston, she's gone. And I don't know if I want to bring her back." Gideon was quiet for a long time. He turned his hat slowly in his hands. "Can I tell you something about my wife?" She looked at him, surprised. He had not, in the weeks she had been here, offered a single personal fact without being directly asked. "Please," she said. Her name was Clara. His voice was even, careful, like a man walking known ground in the dark. "We married young. We'd barely had a year together before she was pregnant. She died trying to bring the baby into the world, and the baby with her." A muscle tightened in his jaw. "For 2 years after I just existed, went through the motions, did the work, didn't feel much of anything." He looked at his hands. "And then one day I had to decide whether I was going to spend the rest of my life being the man I was when she was alive, or become someone new. Someone who carried her but wasn't buried by her." "Which did you choose?" "Both, neither." He met her eyes. "I'm still figuring it out." He paused. "But I know this. The woman who arrived here 5 weeks ago wouldn't have lasted 3 days. The woman sitting in front of me now could run this ranch if she had to." He stood, settling his hat. "You can't unlearn what you know now. Going back doesn't erase it. But it's your choice, not your father's." "Not mine." He moved to the door. "It should always be yours." He left her alone with the letters and the sound of the wind against the window, and the terrifying, unfamiliar weight of choosing her own future. She did not sleep that night. When morning came, she already knew what she would do. She found Warren Sutton in the barn at first light, filling the feed troughs with the mechanical efficiency of a man who had done this particular task for 30 years. "I'm not going back," she said before she could reconsider. He set down the feed bucket slowly and turned to look at her. "My father is offering me everything back. My reputation, my life in Boston, the social position." She met his gaze steadily. "But that life isn't mine anymore. The woman who had it doesn't exist, and I'm not ready to put her back on like a dress that no longer fits." Warren studied her for a long moment. Something shifted behind his eyes, not surprise exactly, but a kind of recognition. "Rose is going to work you twice as hard," he said. "She hates wasted potential." Margaret almost smiled. "I'm counting on it." She wrote to her mother that afternoon, the pen moving slowly as she tried to explain what could not entirely be explained, how calluses could feel like accomplishment, how exhaustion after honest work was entirely different from the exhaustion of performing the right version of yourself for an audience that would never be satisfied. She did not write Gideon's name, but her mother would read between the lines. Her mother had always been good at that. 3 days later, Gideon appeared in the kitchen doorway while Margaret was helping Dolores with the morning biscuits. "North pasture today. We're branding calves." Dolores snorted without looking up. "She's never seen a branding." "Then she'll learn." He met Margaret's eyes. "Unless you'd rather stay where it's safe." Margaret untied her apron and hung it on the hook by the stove. "I'll get changed." The north pasture in the full heat of mid-morning was organized chaos, calves, bellowing men shouting, the sharp chemical smell of heated iron mixing with dust and the particular raw smell of terrified young animals. Martinez and Ben had roped the first two calves and were holding them down with practiced ease. A man named Hector tended the portable forge. "Vaccination duty," Gideon said, placing a syringe in her hand. "After each calf is branded, you inject right here." He indicated the spot on the calf's hindquarter with a touch so quick and efficient it was nearly abstract. "Push in firm. Inject. Pull. Don't hesitate. Hesitation makes it worse." The first calf kicked when she approached. Its eyes were white-rimmed with fear, and Margaret felt a sudden fierce kinship with it, this animal that had done nothing wrong and was being held down and marked by people who had decided its fate without consulting it. She pushed the needle and injected, pulled out. The calf shuddered and was still. She had done it. By the 10th calf, her hands had stopped shaking. By the 20th, she was anticipating, watching which animal was being roped, preparing her syringe in advance, moving into position without being told. "Better than half the men I've hired," Ben said, grinning at her from across a roped calf. "And I mean that as the compliment it is." Something warm and uncomplicated spread through Margaret's chest. Pride. The kind that had nothing to do with being admired and everything to do with being useful. When the work was done, Gideon fell into step beside her as they walked back toward the ranch. "You surprised me today," he said. "I surprise myself most days now." She wiped dust from her forehead with the back of her wrist. "Is that how it works? You change and then you surprise yourself and then you know you've changed." He considered this with the same seriousness he gave Everwings. "Something like that." They walked in comfortable silence through the long afternoon light. The desert smelled of sage and something she had no name for, something particular to this place, to this specific combination of heat and rock and air. She had hated it when she arrived. Now it was starting to smell like something close to home. "Do you miss Boston?" he asked suddenly. "Any of it?" She thought about the library on Newbury Street, about the theater performances her mother had taken her to every season, about the garden in spring before the social calendar transformed it into a stage set. "Some of it," she said honestly. "The parts that were real, but most of what I miss was just the idea of a life, not the life itself, being the right kind of daughter, wearing the right kind of dress, saying the correct thing to the correct person at the correct moment." She glanced at him. "Out here, no one cares if I'm the right kind of anything. I just have to show up and do the work. And that's enough." "It's everything," she said and meant it. They reached the fence line at the edge of the ranch yard, and Gideon stopped his hand, catching her arm gently. "Margaret," he said her name as if it cost him something. "I need to tell you something," and Her heart did a thing she hadn't given it permission to do. When you first arrived, I gave you a week, maybe 10 days if you were stubborn. His thumb brushed unconsciously against her sleeve. You've been here nearly 6 weeks. And you're not just managing, you're becoming part of this place. He let go of her arm. I don't know what to do with that. Is that a problem? It's a problem for me, yes. His voice was honest without being dramatic. Because I'm starting to care what happens to you. More than is sensible. More than is fair to either of us. He looked at her. I needed you to know that. So when I keep my distance, you understand it's not about you. It's about what I can't afford to want. Margaret stepped closer. What makes you think you can't have it? The question landed between them like something lit. Gideon's eyes searched her face. Because you're Margaret Calloway of Boston, and I'm a ranch foreman. And when you finally figure out who you are now, you might decide you want that life back, and He stopped. I can't lose someone again. I barely came through losing Clara. I'm not sure there's enough of me left to survive it twice. I'm not Clara, Margaret said quietly. I'm not going to leave you by dying, and I'm not going to leave by choosing Boston. I've already chosen. She found his hand rough palm against rough palm, both of them calloused now, both of them marked by the same kind of work. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere unless you ask me to. Gideon's fingers tightened slowly around hers. For a long moment he looked at her, really looked at her with the same unflinching honesty he turned on everything, and then he lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles. An old-fashioned gesture, tender enough to make her chest ache. I won't ask you to leave, he said, even when I probably should. That night, Dolores cornered Margaret in the kitchen with the directness of a woman who had watched enough people make avoidable mistakes. Whatever is happening between you and Gideon Cross, she said, handing Margaret a dish to dry, go carefully. Nothing is happening. Don't insult my intelligence. Dolores took the dish back and dried it herself. I'm not telling you to stop. I'm telling you to know what you are walking into. That man does not love halfway. When he gives himself, it's everything. And when it's taken from him, she set the dish down. He nearly didn't survive losing Clara. I watched it. I don't know if there's another survival in him. I'm not going to hurt him. Nobody plans to. Dolores's voice was not unkind, but life makes plans regardless. Just promise me something. What? That you're not staying here because you're running from Boston. That you're staying because you want this. She gestured around the kitchen, the battered table, the heavy stove, the flour-dusted shelves, because one of those reasons will hold and the other one won't. Margaret set down the dishcloth. When I look at my future, she said, and the words came slowly like something being excavated rather than constructed, I see this place. I see this work. I see... She stopped. I see a life I actually want. Not a life that fits someone else's picture of me. Dolores studied her for a long moment. Good, she said at last. Then dry those dishes. We've got 6 more. 3 days after the conversation by the fence line, Margaret woke before 4 to the sound of shouting. She was out of bed and pulling on her boots before she was fully awake, moving on instinct toward the door, toward the orange glow that was already painting the window of her small room the color of something wrong. She stepped outside and stopped. The barn was on fire. The eastern wall had gone up first. She could see that much from the way the flames were thickest there, climbing toward the roofline with an appetite that was terrible in its efficiency. Black smoke poured through the open barn doors. Somewhere inside, the horses were screaming. It was a sound Margaret had never heard before and would not forget, high and raw and absolutely beyond language. Bucket line from the well. Gideon's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and certain, the voice of a man who had decided immediately what needed doing. Martinez, Ben, move Dolores, get the animals away from the near building. Margaret ran toward the barn. Margaret, no. Gideon's arm caught her. It's too far gone, the roof. There are horses in there. She pulled free. How many? 8, Margaret. She went in. The heat hit her like a wall, not warmth, but weight, a physical pressure that pushed against her face and chest. The smoke was immediate and total, turning the familiar interior of the barn into something unrecognizable. Her eyes streamed, her lungs seized. She pressed her arm over her nose and mouth and moved forward by memory by the architecture of a building she had spent 6 weeks learning. First stall on the left. The latch she found it by feel, burning slightly hot under her fingers. She worked it open, found the horse achieved by sound more than sight, a young bay mare half mad with terror, rearing against the stall wall. Margaret grabbed the halter. The mare reared again, nearly lifting her off her feet. Margaret held on, talking in a voice she did not recognize as her own, low, steady, nonsensical, and dragged the animal forward through the smoke and out into the night. Take her. She shoved the lead rope at one of the ranch hands and turned back toward the barn. Margaret, don't. Gideon was there, his face already dark with soot. The roof is going. If that east beam comes down, then help me get them out faster. She went back in. They worked together through the burning barn like two people moving in a language that had no words. Gideon took the stallions and the horses that might trample someone smaller. Margaret took the gentler ones, talking them out through the smoke, keeping her voice even when her lungs were burning and her eyes could barely see. 6 horses out, 7. The smoke was dense enough now that it had weight, something almost tactile pressing in from all sides. We have to go. Gideon's hand found hers in the dark. The last one is too far back. We can't. Which stall, Margaret? Which one? Far end, left side, but the roof. She was already moving. She found the last stall by memory, the far end left side, the place she had put Bess every evening after the cattle drives, the place the old mare had always turned to look at her with those patient, intelligent eyes. Bess. Her voice was barely sound anymore, more shape than noise. Come on, girl. We're going. She got the stall door open. Bess was frozen, pressed back into the corner of the stall, her head down, her eyes white-rimmed and enormous. Margaret grabbed her mane with both hands and pulled with everything she had. Nothing. The mare was beyond reason, beyond responding to anything except the primal imperative to stay still and not move toward the terrible thing. Bess, please. A beam crashed down somewhere behind her, close enough that she felt the heat of the sparks on the back of her neck. The sound of it broke the mare's paralysis like a slap. Bess bolted, slamming into Margaret and knocking her sideways, and she grabbed for the halter and missed, felt herself going down. Strong arms caught her, lifted her. Gideon had come back. He carried her out of the barn at a run, and they fell together onto the dirt outside, just as part of the east wall collapsed, sending a column of sparks and burning timber 20 feet into the night air. Margaret was coughing so hard she could barely breathe. Gideon's arms were still around her. The sound of her own heartbeat was enormous. Bess, she managed. Ben's got her. Gideon's voice was rough with smoke and something else. She made it. Margaret turned her head. Through streaming eyes, she could see all 8 horses in the corral, terrified, singed in places but alive. All of them. The bucket line was still working at the smoldering ruins, keeping the fire from spreading to the other buildings. She let out a breath that she felt in every part of her body. Gideon's hand came up and cupped her face. His thumb moved across her cheekbone, wiping soot, and he looked at her with an expression so unguarded that it was almost painful to see on a face that was usually so careful. Don't ever do that to me again, he said. His voice was wrecked. Don't make me stand outside and watch you run into a burning. I couldn't let them die. I know. His jaw tightened. I know. But he stopped, his thumb stilled against her face. I can't pretend anymore. Pretend what that I don't. He stopped again. God help me, Margaret. I love you. I didn't want to. I tried not to. I spent 6 weeks trying not to, and tonight I thought I was going to watch you. He closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, they were wet, and she realized she was seeing something Gideon Cross had not shown to anyone in a very long time. I can't do this unless I say it out loud. I love you. Margaret kissed him. It was not graceful. They were both filthy, both exhausted, both tasting smoke and something close to terror. But it was the most honest thing she had ever done. And when Gideon kissed her back, he did it like a man who had been holding his breath for months. When they finally separated, his forehead rested against hers. Around them, the ranch hands had quietly, tactfully found other things to attend to. Dolores stood near the smoking ruins with her arms crossed, but even at this distance, Margaret could see the particular expression on her face, not surprise, satisfaction. Tell me you're staying, Gideon said. Tell me this isn't just the fire talking. I chose to stay before the fire, Margaret said. I'm choosing it again now. I'm choosing you. She pulled back enough to look at him. Not because you saved me tonight, because you saw me the night I arrived, and you told me the truth when no one else was bothering to. He kissed her again, softer this time. Deliberate. Warren Sutton cleared his throat from a polite distance. Horses are all accounted for. No major injuries. He paused. You saved them, Miss Calloway. We saved them, Margaret corrected. No, Warren's voice was firm. Gideon knew what he was doing. You ran in without training, without experience, because you couldn't stand to let them suffer. He met her eyes. That's not skill. That's character. You've more than earned your place here. The next morning, Margaret found a folded note that had been slipped under her door sometime before dawn. She recognized the handwriting from the supply ledgers Gideon maintained in the tack room. Direct, economical, slightly angular. Margaret, I'm not built for long speeches, so I'll be brief. Last night I watched you run into a burning building, and I understood something I'd been avoiding for weeks. I've been existing since Clara died. Going through the work, going through the days, keeping everyone at enough distance that nothing could reach me. Then you showed up with your proper Boston dresses and your absolute refusal to quit, and you made me feel things I had decided I was finished feeling. I know it's fast. I know a sensible man would wait and be patient and careful. But I've learned that life doesn't hand out guarantees, and I don't want to spend whatever time we have being cautious. Will you let me court you properly? Will you give me the chance to show you I can be a man worth choosing? I'll understand if the answer is no, but I had to ask, Gideon. Margaret pressed the letter against her chest and felt something settle in her. Not the fluttering performative excitement of Boston courtships, all calculation and display and careful management of impressions. Something different, something that felt less like the beginning of a story and more like the recognition of one already underway. She found him in the temporary corral before breakfast, checking the horses in the early light. He looked up when she approached, his expression carefully neutral, in the way of a man who has said something significant and is now waiting to find out what it cost him. She walked up to him and kissed him in full view of anyone who cared to look. When she stepped back, his eyes were wide. Yes, she said, to all of it. His smile changed his entire face. I don't have much to offer. No theater boxes, no dinner parties. I don't want dinner parties. She looked around them at the horses, at the desert going gold in the early light, at the ruins of the barn that would have to be rebuilt. I want to wake up every morning and know my work matters. I want to build something real. She took his hand. I want to do it with someone who sees me as a partner. You're going to get bored, he said. But he was smiling. 6 months from now, you'll be begging me to take you to a dance. Then take me to a dance and then bring me home to this. She squeezed his hand. I'm not asking for perfection, Gideon. I'm asking for real. And this, she pressed his fingers, this is the most real thing I've ever had. Bah, Jane. The morning after that, they stood together in the ruins of the burned barn and assessed what remained. The smell of old smoke still hung in the air, acrid in particular. Charred timber lay across the dirt floor in angular collapse like a building folded in on itself. The hay, what hadn't burned, was ruined by water from the bucket line. The tools attacked the carefully organized order of the space, all of it gone. We need new lumber, Warren said. He was looking at the ruins the way a man looks at a reckoning. New tools, new fittings. The insurance won't cover half of it. We're looking at $3,000 we don't have. Could we sell from the herd? Margaret asked. Gideon shook his head. Sell breeding stock now, and you lose next year's calves. You lose the year after. You never catch up. Warren kicked at a piece of charred wood. Then I don't know what we do. Margaret looked at the ruins. She thought of the charity events she had organized in Boston, the ones that had seemed so consequential at the time, so carefully managed, the linen pressed and the seating charts agonized over. She had been good at that. She had been very good at making people feel that gathering together was something they wanted to do, rather than something they'd been maneuvered into. A barn raising, she said. Both men looked at her. Like the old days, she continued before either of them could object. You've lived here 30 years, Warren. You've helped every rancher in this valley at least once. If we provide the food and the materials, if we make it a social event, people will come. We can't afford the materials, Warren said. Ben's father owns the lumberyard, Gideon said slowly. He was looking at Margaret with something that was partly surprise and partly the expression of a man watching an equation resolve itself. He might discount if we're putting together a community build. And Dolores knows every woman in 3 counties, Margaret added. If we make it a proper occasion, food, music, dancing after the work, this isn't just a ranch that needs help. It's a community gathering. People show up for those. Warren looked between them. If this fails, he said at last, it's on both of you. Understood, Margaret said. Let us start the letters. She spent the next week writing letters, visiting neighboring ranches with Gideon, planning food logistics with Dolores, coordinating lumber quantities with Ben's father at the yard in town. It was the most demanding organizational work she had ever done, not because it was more complex than Boston's social season, but because it was real. Every detail mattered because the ranch's future depended on it, not because some matron would remark on the quality of the napkin folding. Gideon watched her work with an expression she was still learning to read. You're good at this, he said one evening as she sealed the last of the invitations. I had good training. She handed him the stack. I just never had a good reason to use it before. By Wednesday, replies were arriving. By Friday, 17 families had confirmed. The Martinezes, the Hendersons, the Crawfords, who, according to Warren, had not spoken to him in 5 years over a disputed fence line. I can't believe this is working, Warren said, reading through the acceptances. People want to help, Margaret said. They just need to be asked properly. That evening, Gideon found her at the corral fence watching the horses settle in the cooling dusk. He leaned on the fence beside her, close enough that their arms were almost touching. I've been thinking, he said, about what comes after the barn. He was quiet for a moment. About what we are, what we could be. He turned to look at her. I'm a ranch foreman, Margaret. I earn decent wages and I live in a small house on Warren's property, and I'll never be rich. That's just the truth of it. I know. I'm asking you to know it and mean it. His thumb traced absent circles on the top rail of the fence. Because I'm falling deeper every day. And if this is temporary for you, if you're thinking of this as something you'll look back on, I need to know that now, before I can't. His voice was even but not easy. Losing Clara nearly finished me. I'm not sure I'd survive it twice. Margaret turned to face him fully. It's not temporary, she said. I don't know every detail of what the future looks like, but I know you're in it. I know this place is in it. That's not going to change. She rose on her toes and kissed him briefly, firmly, like a period at the end of a sentence. Stop waiting for me to leave, Gideon. I'm here, I'm staying. He pulled her close, his chin resting on the top of her head, and she felt him exhale a slow, long breath, like a man releasing something he'd been holding for a very long time. I'm the luckiest man alive, he said quietly, and I promise I'll try to stop waiting for disaster. Above them, the first stars were beginning to appear in the enormous desert sky. The horses moved softly in the corral. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called once and went quiet. Margaret stood in the circle of his arms and felt for the first time in a long time entirely unhurried. The morning of the barn raising arrived clear and wide open, the sky overhead, the deep, unclouded blue that Margaret had come to associate with days when the desert intended to cooperate. By 7 o'clock, wagons were rolling through the gate. Families came from every ranch within 40 miles, men in work clothes with tools in hand, women with covered dishes, and the particular organized energy of people who understood what a feeding operation required. Children spilled out of wagon beds and immediately began the serious business of getting in everyone's way. Margaret stood in the ranch yard and watched them come and felt something expand in her chest that she didn't have an adequate word for. Stop standing there looking amazed and start directing people, Dolores said, appearing at her elbow. The women need to know where to set up food. The men need someone to tell them where the lumber's staged. Move. Margaret moved. For the next 4 hours, she was everywhere, kitchen to work, site to kitchen, settling small disputes about lumber placement, helping Dolores organize a food operation that was feeding 60 people across 3 shifts, locating the extra hammers. When Ben shouted that they'd run short, translating between Warren's vision and the practical logistics of men who had their own opinions about how a barn ought to be framed. It was nothing like managing a Boston social event. It was harder, louder, more chaotic, more physical, and more important than any dinner party she had ever orchestrated, and she loved every unruly second of it. By noon, the frame was going up. Gideon moved between the work teams with quiet authority, directing without commanding, answering questions, without stopping doing the particular kind of leadership that made the people around him better, without drawing attention to itself. She watched him from across the site when she had a moment to spare and found that watching him work did something to her that she had given up trying to rationalize. She was carrying a tray of water cups to the men on the frame crew when she heard a voice behind her. "Margaret Calloway, I almost didn't recognize you." She turned. Harrison Blackwell stood at the edge of the ranch yard. He was impeccably dressed, linen suit, polished boots, a hat that had never seen a day's actual sun. He looked like a man who had stepped out of a Boston drawing room and directly into the wrong landscape, which was exactly what he was. His face wore the particular expression she remembered. The careful smile, the studied ease, the performance of charm that she had once found persuasive and now recognized as a kind of costume. Her hands went very still. "Harrison," her voice came out level. "What are you doing here? Looking for you." He smiled as if they had parted on pleasant terms. "Your mother told me where you'd gone. I came to set things right." His eyes moved over her, the work dress, the sunburned face, the calloused hands holding the water tray, with an expression he wasn't quite able to control. "My family is prepared to issue a complete public retraction. Your reputation fully restored. Your father has arranged everything." He stepped closer. "Come home, Margaret. Your real life is waiting for you." Gideon appeared beside her. She had not heard him approach. She never did. He moved with that quiet economy of motion. But he was there, solid and certain, and he looked at Harrison Blackwell the way he looked at things that required assessment. "Who is this?" he asked, his voice even. "Harrison Blackwell." Harrison extended his hand. "I'm a friend of Margaret's from Boston." Gideon looked at the hand and did not take it. "She doesn't look like she considers you a friend." "We had a misunderstanding. You lied about her." Gideon's voice remained perfectly calm, which made it worse. "You paid witnesses to destroy her reputation because she wouldn't give you what you wanted. That's not a misunderstanding." Harrison's smile stayed in place, but something behind his eyes changed. He looked at Gideon the way a man looks at an obstacle he's already decided is temporary. "Perhaps I should speak with Margaret privately," he said. "You can speak right here," Margaret said. Harrison turned back to her, and the smile widened warmer now, directed specifically at her, recalibrated. "Margaret, be reasonable. You're a Calloway of Boston. You have a name, a future, a social position." He gestured around the work at the men with hammers, at the sawdust in the air, at Gideon standing next to her. "You don't belong here. Whatever this is, it's a temporary diversion. Your real life isn't. This is my real life." The words came out quietly, but they stopped him. "Margaret, get off this property." Warren Sutton's voice came from behind Harrison, and Margaret saw that Martinez and Ben had materialized from somewhere nearby, their expressions identically flat. "You weren't invited. You're not welcome." Harrison looked at the circle of people who had quietly, without fuss, arranged themselves around Margaret, the ranch hands, the neighboring ranchers who had stopped their work when the unfamiliar carriage arrived and had not yet resumed it. He was a man who understood power, and he understood immediately that the kind of power he was used to wielding did not function in this particular geography. The smile dropped. "You're making a mistake," he said to Margaret. His voice had lost its warmth. "When you're stuck out here, when the novelty wears off, you'll remember I offered you a way back." "I am back," Margaret said. "This is where I belong." She took Gideon's hand. "These are my people, and you need to leave before I ask them to help you with that." Harrison looked at the hands still holding hammers. He looked at Warren's face and at Martinez's and at the particular expression on Gideon Cross, which had not changed at all throughout the entire exchange, and was precisely because of that more threatening than any raised voice could have been. He left. His carriage disappeared through the gate in a small cloud of dust. Margaret stood where she was, trembling slightly, not with fear. She realized, but with the particular physical aftermath of sustained tension, the way a bowstring trembles after the arrow has been released. Gideon's arm came around her shoulders, and she leaned into it briefly, feeling the solidity of him. "You all right?" he said quietly. I'm perfect. She meant it. Facing Harris and Blackwell with her feet on this ground, surrounded by these people, she had felt nothing for him, not anger, not fear, not grief. Just a clear, uncomplicated recognition of what he was and what he was not. He was a man still trapped in a world of appearances. She was free of it. That took guts, said a man named Crawford, a rancher in his 60s who had the bearing of someone who measured his words carefully because he didn't have many to spare. Standing up to that kind of man in front of everyone. It took clarity, Margaret said, and knowing I had people who would stand with me. Crawford nodded once deliberately. Man bothers you again, he'll have an answer to give all of us. He looked around at the other ranchers who nodded in the particular way of people who mean what they say and don't require much ceremony about it. Margaret felt something sting in her eyes that she was not going to let become tears. Thank you, she managed. All of you. Enough talk, Dolores called from the kitchen doorway. Food's getting cold. Back to work, everyone. The spell broke cleanly. The hammers resumed. The lumber went up. The frame climbed. By sunset, the barn stood complete, the frame strong and straight against the evening sky, the new wood bright against the darker earth around it. The men were tired in the satisfied way of people who had spent themselves on something worth doing. The women were cleaning up the remnants of an afternoon's worth of feeding an army, and someone had produced a fiddle and begun to play. Families gathered in the ranch yard as the light went golden and low. Children chased each other between the adults. Old couples sat in chairs and watched with the comfortable pleasure of people who had seen many such evenings and knew their value. Young couples drifted toward the music. Gideon found Margaret near the new barn, her head tilted back, looking at what they'd built. Come and dance with me, he said. I don't know how to dance to fiddle music. I'll teach you. He took her hand and led her toward the music. It's not complicated. Just follow my lead and try not to think about it. The pattern was simple, a turning stepping rhythm that bore no resemblance to the formal figures Margaret had spent years perfecting in Boston ballrooms. She stepped on his foot twice. He laughed a real laugh, unguarded and warm, the laugh of a man who had decided not to be careful, and pulled her closer and kept dancing. Marry me, he said. She missed a step. What, marry me? His eyes were steady, serious, entirely present. I know it's fast. A sensible man would wait. But watching you face down Harrison Blackwell today, watching you build this, he gestured around them at the barn, at the community in the ranch yard, at the life they had made together out of disaster and stubbornness, and something that had started as honesty and grown into something much larger. I don't want to be sensible. I want to wake up next to you every morning. I want to build this life with you officially. I want everyone to know you're mine and I'm yours. Margaret looked at him for a long moment. Yes, she said, and then again because it felt worth saying twice yes. His smile was like a change in the weather. He kissed her there in the middle of the ranch yard while the fiddle played and the children ran, and the old couples watched from their chairs with knowing satisfaction. And when they finally separated, there was applause from the people close enough to have noticed, and Martinez let out a whoop that startled the horses in the corral. Margaret laughed. She could not remember when she had last laughed like that fully, from somewhere deep, without calculation or performance, without considering how it appeared or to whom. The next morning, Dolores sat on the edge of Margaret's bed with her arms folded and the expression of a woman who has something to say and intends to say it. So you're marrying Gideon Cross, Margaret sat up. News travels fast. You proposed under the stars in front of 50 witnesses. Dolores's expression softened just slightly at the corners. He deserves this happiness. He has earned it 10 times over. She held Margaret's gaze. But I need you to tell me the truth. What truth? Are you marrying him because you love him, or because Boston is finished for you and you need somewhere to land? Margaret met her eyes without flinching. I'm marrying him because when I look at my future, any version of my future, any day or year of it, he's in every part of it. Not because he helped me, because he saw me when I was covered in flour and smelled like the chicken coop and still treated me like someone worth seeing. Dolores held the look for a moment longer. Then she stood. Wedding's in 2 weeks. I'm making your dress. You don't get a say. She headed for the door. Warren's already spoken to the minister. Enough sentiment. We have breakfast to cook. The day before the wedding, a telegram arrived. Margaret was in the kitchen helping Dolores finish the preparations, more food than she had thought possible, organized with military precision when Warren came in with it. She recognized the routing marks on the envelope, and her heart gave a single hard kick. She opened it. Arriving on the Thursday stage stop, Father sends his blessing, stop. Bringing nothing but myself, stop. Your loving mother. She's coming. Margaret set the telegram down on the table with hands that were not entirely steady. My mother is coming. Dolores looked up from the pie she was crimping. Just her, Bonjour, the sperm. Just her. She stared at the telegram. My father is sending his blessing. But not himself. No, she wasn't sure yet what she felt about that. Relief and disappointment were doing something complicated in her chest, and she left them to it. The dress from Boston, Dolores said. Are you wearing it? Margaret looked at the simple white dress hanging on the back of her door, the one Dolores had made over the past 2 weeks with its careful embroidery at the collar and cuffs, its practical cut, its complete absence of pretension. No, she said. I'm wearing this one. Okay. Her mother arrived on the Thursday afternoon stage exactly as she had said she would. Gideon Calloway stepped down from the stage looking precisely as Margaret remembered her, composed, elegant, impeccably dressed for travel. And then she saw Margaret on the platform, and her composure came apart at the seams. Oh, my darling. She crossed the distance between them and pulled her daughter into her arms, and Margaret, who had not been held like this in months, pressed her face into her mother's shoulder and let herself be held. Let me look at you, Gideon said at last, holding Margaret at arm's length. Margaret knew what her mother was seeing, the sun-darkened skin, the work-roughened hands, the sturdiness that had replaced the careful softness of a debutante's cultivated posture. You look different, her mother said. I am different. I know. Vivian's eyes were bright. You look happy, Margaret. Genuinely, completely happy. I've been trying to remember when I last saw that on your face, and I cannot find the memory. They walked together back to the ranch. Margaret answering questions about the work, about Dolores, about Warren, about New Mexico, and what the desert looked like in spring, and what it felt like to ride cattle in the early morning, with the particular candor of someone who has nothing left to hide or manage. And Gideon, her mother asked, tell me about him. Margaret considered how to describe Gideon Cross to a woman who had known nothing but Boston's careful hierarchies. He's not like the men at home, she said at last. He doesn't care about our family name, or what connections I can offer, or whether I'm decorative. He cares that I show up for work, that I'm honest, that I don't quit. She paused. He sees me, not the version of me that Boston wanted, the actual me. Do you love him? More than I knew was possible. Her mother smiled, a quiet, private smile, the kind that had nothing to do with social performance. Then that's all that matters. When they reached the ranch and Gideon came out to meet them, dusty from the afternoon's work, his shirt stained, his hands calloused, Vivian's face did something complicated. It wasn't disapproval. It was the involuntary reflex of a woman who had spent decades in a world where a man's worth was legible in his clothing, meeting something that required a different set of instruments entirely. Gideon removed his hat. Mrs. Calloway, it's an honor. Vivian shook his hand. My daughter speaks very highly of you, Mr. Cross. She's generous. I'm a lucky man. His arms settled around Margaret's waist, the easy, unconscious gesture of someone who has stopped being careful about it. I'll make sure she's taken care of. You have my word on that. I don't doubt your sincerity, Vivian said, and Margaret could hear her mother choosing her words with precision. But taking care of Margaret in the way she's mama. Margaret's voice was gentle but firm. Gideon takes care of me in the ways that matter. He treats me as a partner. He values my work and my opinions. He doesn't want me to be ornamental. She met her mother's eyes. That's more than any man in Boston was prepared to offer. Vivian looked at her daughter for a long moment. Then she looked at Gideon. Then she looked at the two of them together, at the particular way Margaret stood when she was next to him, not arranged, not managed, but simply herself, and Margaret saw the moment her mother stopped calculating and simply understood. I brought your wedding dress, Vivian said at last, the one we had made. I'd like you to see the one Dolores made, Margaret said. It's different, but it's right. That evening, Vivian stood in the small room behind the kitchen and watched her daughter try on the simple white dress with its embroidered collar and its honest, practical cut. Dolores moved around her, adjusting the hem with the authority of someone who would not accept imprecision. "It's lovely," Vivian said softly. "You look like yourself, your real self." "The dress from Boston," Margaret said. "We could sell it, use the money for the ranch supplies." Her mother pressed her handkerchief to her mouth. "That feels exactly right," she said when she had composed herself. "That feels like exactly what it should become." The wedding was held in the new barn. It seemed right, this space that the community had built together, that smelled of fresh-cut lumber, and the particular warmth of a space newly made for purpose, was the proper setting for what was about to be made. The afternoon light came through the new windows in long, slanted shafts and fell across the assembled faces. Ranch hands scrubbed clean and uncomfortable in their good shirts, neighboring families in their best. Vivian Calloway, sitting in the front, with Dolores in an alliance that had formed in approximately 24 hours and showed every sign of being permanent burned. Margaret stood at the barn door and breathed. Gideon was at the far end, in his best shirt, freshly pressed, his hair damp and neat-looking, like a man who had decided something and was at peace with having decided it. He watched her walk toward him with an expression she recognized now, the one that appeared on his face when he stopped being careful and let what he was actually feeling be visible. The minister from town spoke the words that had been spoken at 10,000 such occasions, in 10,000 such places, and that were nonetheless entirely new when they were yours. "Do you, Margaret Calloway, take this man?" She looked into Gideon's eyes and saw her future in them. Not a picture-perfect version, not the curated image of a life, but the actual thing, with its work and its difficulty and its particular satisfactions and its absolute refusal to be anything other than real. "I do," she said. "Do you, Gideon Cross, take this woman? I do." His voice was rough around the edges, the way it always was when he was feeling something he hadn't entirely prepared for. "Then by the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife." He kissed her as if it were the most natural thing in the world, and the barn erupted. Martinez whooped, Ben threw his hat. Vivian wept with her handkerchief pressed to her face, and Dolores, who had said she would not cry, was very carefully not looking at anyone. Margaret laughed against her husband's mouth. Husband. The word was still new enough to feel slightly unreal, but she found she liked the realness of it. The celebration lasted into the night. Someone had brought a fiddle and someone else had brought a guitar, and the combination produced music that had nothing to do with the formal orchestrations of Boston ballrooms, and everything to do with dancing until your feet hurt because you were surrounded by people you loved. Margaret danced with Gideon and stepped on his feet and didn't apologize for it, and he laughed and pulled her closer, and that was all. She saw her mother and Dolores sitting together near the edge of the dancing, talking with the ease of women who have discovered they understand each other better than they expected. She heard her mother say at one point, "She's happier than I've ever seen anyone," and she heard Dolores say, "I know it. I knew it 6 weeks ago when she looked at that pile of laundry and said, I'll learn instead of quitting." She heard her mother say quietly, "I just wish her father could see this," and she heard Dolores say, "Give him time. Some men need to understand a thing from the outside before they can accept it." Later, Gideon led her away from the celebration across the ranch yard in the dark to the small house at the edge of the property that she had noticed but never entered. He opened the door and she saw what he had done: fresh curtains, a new quilt, wildflowers in a jar on the table. The small, sturdy space transformed by the kind of effort that doesn't announce itself. "It's not much," he said. She kissed him quiet. "It's everything," she said. 2 days later, Margaret's mother prepared to return to Boston. They stood together on the Crestwood platform, the morning stage already pulled up and waiting, and Margaret held her mother's hands and tried to find the words for something that didn't have them. "I'll write every week," she said. "I'll tell you everything. And I'll write back." Her mother's eyes were bright but controlled. "Margaret," she held her daughter's face in both hands. "I'm so proud of you. I should have said it more when it was easier to say. I was so busy making sure you fit that I never once asked if you wanted to." "I needed to leave," Margaret said. "I needed to come here. I needed to become this." She pressed her mother's hands. "You gave me the locket. You believed me when it mattered. That was enough. It wasn't enough, but I'm grateful you'll take it as enough." Vivian pulled her close one last time. "You've become a remarkable woman. stronger than I ever managed. The stage driver called the departure. Vivienne stepped up, arranged herself, looked down at her daughter through the window with something in her expression that was past sadness, past pride, somewhere into the territory of a parent releasing what they love into a life they couldn't have built for them. Margaret waved until the stage was gone. Then she walked back to the ranch where Gideon was in the corral with a young horse and climbed the fence to sit on the top rail and watch him work. "You all right?" he asked without stopping. "I'm perfect," she said, and meant it. 3 months after the wedding, Margaret was in the kitchen helping Dolores with the morning bread, when a wave of nausea hit her so hard she had to grip the edge of the counter and breathe very deliberately through her nose. Dolores looked at her, one look sharp, assessing certain. "When was your last monthly?" she asked. Margaret counted backward. Her hands were still on the counter. "6 weeks," she said, "maybe 7. "You're pregnant," Dolores said. Not a question. "I'm not certain." "I am." Dolores's expression shifted, the iron softening just briefly in a way it rarely did. "Does he know?" Not yet. He knew something was different that evening. He always did. He read her with the same patient attention he gave the horse, and she had stopped being surprised by it. "What's going on?" he asked when they were sitting in their small house after supper, his hand over hers on the table. Margaret looked at him, at his steady, careful eyes, at the face she had come to know, the way you come to know a landscape, not all at once, but in accumulated dailiness, until it is as familiar as your own. "I think I'm pregnant," she said. He went very still. "You think, I'm late." "Dolores is sure. I wanted to tell you before I was completely certain." He was off the chair and kneeling in front of her before she had finished speaking, his hands on her face, his eyes doing something complicated and unguarded. "We're having a baby," he said. "It looks that way." He pressed his forehead against her stomach, his shoulders shaking, and Margaret's hands went to his hair. She realized he was crying, not quietly, not with the managed dignity that he brought to most things, but with the full weight of a man feeling something too large to contain. "Clara," he managed into the fabric of her dress. "After Clara, I thought this part of my life was finished. I thought—" He stopped. "And now I have you. And a child. And a life I actually want to be in." "You deserve it," Margaret set her fingers in his hair. "You stayed. You kept working. You opened your heart again, even though it terrified you. You deserve every bit of this." He pulled her down to the floor with him, both of them kneeling on the rough boards of their small house, and held her like a man who has finally completely stopped bracing for the loss of something. 6 months later, Margaret was in the barn helping with the evening feeding when a rider appeared in the yard with the weekly mail. Gideon brought the telegram in. He read it, and his expression went careful and unreadable, the particular expression she had learned to recognize as him giving her time to prepare. "It's from your father," he said. Her heart jumped once hard. "What does it say?" He handed it to her. "Request permission to visit. Desire to make amends and meet my son-in-law. Will accept whatever answer comes. Your father." Margaret stood holding the telegram in her round, obvious state in the barn that smelled of horses and fresh hay, in the life she had chosen with absolute deliberateness. She thought about the man in his Boston study who had handed her an envelope and turned his back on her. She thought about the letters he had written her, the one shaky and ashamed, the one she had read until the paper softened at the folds. She thought about second chances, how she had been given one arriving here broken, and what it had made of her. She thought about forgiveness, which she had come to understand was not the same as forgetting, and which did not require the erasure of what had been done. "He can come," she said, "after the baby is born. He comes here on our terms, and he sees this life as it is. He doesn't get a version of it that's been made presentable for his comfort." Gideon kissed the top of her head. "That's my girl." Their daughter was born on a cold January night, with the wind coming down off the distant mountains and the fire in the small house burning high. Dolores delivered her with the competence of a woman who had done this before and had opinions about how it should be done. Gideon held Margaret's hand through every hour of it, and when the baby finally arrived, angry and small and entirely herself, he held her in his work-rough hands and was completely undone. They named her Clara Grace. Clara for the woman who had loved him first and for whom he had grieved long enough. Grace for everything that had been given to all of them when it was least expected. Warren Calloway arrived 3 weeks later. He came by stage, then hired a wagon from Crestwood and arrived at the ranch in mid-morning, stepping down onto the hard ground of the ranch yard in his good suit and his polished shoes, looking at the adobe house and the repaired barn and the horses in the corral and the mountains beyond with the expression of a man seeing something he had not prepared himself for. Margaret met him at the door with the baby in her arms. She watched her father look at her. He took in everything, the dress that had been washed to near whiteness, the baby bundled against her chest, the work-hardened hands, the face that was sun-darkened and calm and absolutely foreign to the debutante he thought he had sent west. Margaret, his voice broke on the second syllable. Papa. She stepped back. Come in, meet your granddaughter. He stood in the doorway of the small house, hers and Gideon's, and the expensive suit and polished shoes looked like what they were, clothes from a different world worn by a man who was standing in territory he had not earned the right to know and was trying to understand it anyway. I'm sorry, he said. I'm sorry for all of it. I chose my pride when I should have chosen you. And there is not a day since that I haven't. I know, Margaret said, not forgiving him, not yet, but acknowledging that the accounting was real. He looked at the baby. May I hold her? She handed Clara Grace to her grandfather and watched a man she had spent months being furious with cradle his granddaughter with the same terrified, tender care that men have always brought to new things they don't want to break. She's beautiful, he said, his voice thick. She's herself, Margaret said, and she'll grow up knowing she can be whoever she needs to be. That's what we're giving her. Gideon came in from the barn, stopping briefly in the doorway when he saw the scene. He read it, he always read things, and stepped forward without hesitation. Mr. Calloway. He extended his hand. Warren transferred the baby carefully back to Margaret and shook it. The two men looked at each other, Boston and New Mexico, silk and calloused skin, the world that had broken Margaret and the world that had rebuilt her. You take care of my daughter, Warren said. I try to deserve her, Gideon said, every day. Something shifted in her father's face. Not absolution, she was not ready to offer that, and he had not asked for it, but recognition. The recognition of a man seeing for the first time that his daughter had found something he could not have planned for her and would not have known to want for her. He stayed 3 days. He ate meals with the ranch hands and slept in the main house with Warren Sutton and watched Margaret work in the kitchen with Dolores and helped Gideon carry water to the corral without being asked. On his last morning, he pulled Margaret aside after breakfast. I was wrong, he said, about what you needed, about what a good life looks like, about everything. He took her hands, her calloused, work-hardened hands, and held them. You have built something real here, something that will last. He looked up at her. I'm proud of you. I should have said that years ago. I'm saying it now. Thank you, Papa. She felt something loosen in her chest, some knot that had been there since a midnight study in Boston, something that did not disappear entirely but became smaller, more manageable, less defining. That matters more than you know. His carriage left after breakfast, heading back toward the stage line, back toward Boston and the life that had once been hers. Margaret stood in the ranch yard with Gideon beside her and Clara Grace between them and watched it go. No regrets, he asked. She looked around at the ranch that was hers, at the barn they had built from community and stubbornness, at the horses in the corral and the mountains on the horizon and the life she had not chosen and then had chosen completely with full knowledge of what she was choosing. Not one, she said. She turned and kissed her husband, and the baby between them made a small, indignant sound at being squeezed, and Gideon laughed against her mouth, that open, unguarded laugh she had never expected to hear from him, and now could not imagine a day without. Standing there in the New Mexico morning, Margaret Calloway Maddox, formerly of Boston, now entirely of here, understood the final truth of what her father's punishment had revealed. He had sent her west to be diminished. Instead, she had been excavated layer by careful layer until what remained was the part of her that had always been real and had never until now been given sufficient room to be itself. She had come here as a sentence. She was staying as a choice. And the cowboy who had been tasked with watching her learn humility had instead spent 8 months watching her discover that she had never needed to be humbled, only seen. Really seen clearly and without agenda by someone patient enough to look. She had found that person. She had found this life. She had found herself. It was, she thought, more than enough. It was everything.